Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the NBS Alumni Leaders Dialogue, Navigating the Paradoxes of Leadership. Thank you for being here with us today for this important and timely presentation. My name is Marissa, a final year student at Nanyang Business School, and I'll be your MC this morning. It's an honor to have such a distinguished group of senior leaders and professionals with us at this special event. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed speaker, Professor David Waldman, and our moderator, Ms Karen Leong. Professor David Waldman is a Dean's Counsel Distinguished Professor of Management in the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University, and is recognized as one of the world's top 10 leadership researchers. His work has been instrumental in shaping our understanding of leadership, especially in navigating the complex and often contradictory challenges leaders face. We are thrilled to hear his insights on the paradoxes of leadership today. Our moderator, Ms Karen Leong, is a transformational thought leader and a highly respected professional in influence and organizational dynamics. Also an alumni of NBS, her expertise to lead thought-provoking discussions makes her the perfect person to guide today's Q&A session. To start off this morning's session, let us welcome the Dean of NBS, Professor Chun Yang, to give us an opening address. Professor, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and Happy Chinese New Year. So it's good to have you, the distinguished guests, our alumni and colleagues, for coming in early in the morning. And this is going to be a fantastic event. And it's good to see over time some familiar faces. So I know more and more of our alums and community leaders and senior professionals. So this is one of our NBS Alumni Leader Dialogue. So we started this series in 2018, and this is part of our effort to provide continuing training education to our alumni community. So leadership is not static. You all know it better than me. The first thing I'm waiting for since I became the dean is the leadership training session. So now the exec coach interviewed all 15 people working around me. I'm ready to take the first lesson. So I really look forward to today's lecture, especially given now every day we hear some news, right? Look at, I don't know whether we should use leaders with quotation mark. The decisions by the world leaders every day, every morning, or every evening, there are so many changes, and they are tough decisions, many challenges we face. So today's lecture and the discussions are going to be very valuable. So NBS, not only Nanyang Business School, I learned to use the acronyms since I came to Singapore. Nanyang Business School not only talks about leaderships, but also we practice leadership. Let me give you 3 examples. The first thing is we just launched NBS Global Leaders Program last November. The first cohort is going to be August 2025. So this is a new programming targeting top students from Singapore, not only academically. These are the students who want to not only adapt to future changes, but have the mindset to drive future changes in Singapore, in the region, and in the world. So right now, we're in the planning stage. Many of you are already helping us. So this is the program. We're going to send the students extensively to have overseas experiences at top US and European schools. We're going to give them leadership training and mentoring sessions, and they're going to all engage a final year founders project. So they're going to work in team of 3 to create some projects that have real impact to the business and to community. So that's something we're really looking forward. We're in the process of launching. Actually, Professor Matt Dirt, who were on that table, is the director of that program. He had to go because he's teaching today. So the second thing, there are 2, a pair. We launched 2 public lecture series. The first one is the Dean's Distinguished public lecture series. Professor David Waldman's lecture today is part of that. So this is where we bring thought leaders from around the world. These are really the best scholars in the area, top 10, top 5, top 3 scholars in the area. We bring them to Singapore. We bring them to NBS. So this way we can learn from the grad masters about the field knowledge. And this is where we connect to our alumni community, connect to Singapore and to the rest. So last year we hosted 2 lectures. One is on the decoupling, actually financial decoupling between US and China, and what's implications on the rest of the world, including Singapore. We had another one on economics of buyouts, and the one coming up, which is, which day? This one. Okay, this is on the 18th because we have a pair, they're 2 days apart. So this one is on something we're thinking about every day, thriving with AI. So this is about artificial intelligence, what the challenges, opportunities that AI is bringing to us, to the business community. So these are all hybrid events. We host this particular event at Gaia, and you can scan the QR code. You're welcome to attend the event in person, or you can dial in online. So this is of our one of our events, and we have 6 to 8 of such events. And the next series is the public series on sustainable business. I know we have a few chief sustainability officers here, so we kickstart that series 2 weeks ago. So that's a joint effort with United Nations sponsored PRI. PRI is Principles for Responsible Investments, and the ECGI, that's the European Corporate Governance Institute. So that's a public lecture series. We brought in top scholars who are doing research on the sustainability side and connect them with practitioners. So why we partner with UNPRI? Because PRI has 5,000 plus signatory members, and together they manage more than $130 trillion. So as academia, we do research, but we want to make real impact. We want to direct or redirect resources to where we can really change sustainability. So that's one of the series. European Corporate Governance Institute is based in Brussels, and they have reached more than 9,000 top scholars in the world, legal scholars, management scholars, finance, economics, accounting, and there we can really reach out to top thought leaders. So the first one, we kicked it out two weeks ago, and these are all also hybrid events. For this particular one, this is an online webinar. So this second one is about ESG investing and green transition. In the spectrum of ESG, we know there are many changes lately, right? There are discussions of the upside. Now you see some reversal in some states in the US. So what's the most recent development, and what is the green transition target? Where we stand right now, what needs to be done? So this is the public lecture on February 20th. So for the very first inaugural lecture, there are more than 800 people registered, and 1/3 are from the US, 1/3 are from Europe, the rest 1/3 are from Singapore and the region. And along the same line, we just won the hosting right of a conference organized by ARC, that's Alliances of Research for Corporate Sustainability. So how important it is, that's alliances supported by top universities like Harvard, Rochester, Michigan, Virginia, and so on, Duke. And we beat, in getting this hosting right, we beat Wharton, and also we beat another premier business school in Singapore. To tell you how important it is, this is the very first time since 2009, the conference, a leading research conference, sustainability, is held in Asia. So we brought this conference to Asia, we brought it to Singapore. We want to bring the thought leaders to this region because Singapore is right in the middle of the economic powerhouse. Many activities and many challenges are here in this region. We want to be the leader. We want to keep leading this great global effort. So I encourage you to join these events, and I hope that you can stay in tune. So every month, essentially, we have an event. We're going to send email to you, or if you leave WhatsApp information, we can reach out to you. And this brings us to today's talk, because we're talking about leadership, driving sustainability. And leadership is a very important topic. And today, especially with this complex and without any exaggeration, ever-changing or constantly changing world. So we want to have this discussion, especially when we face contradictory demand, even though they are interrelated. As a leader, many of you are the CEO, CIO, Chief Sustainability Officer, or President in large organizations. How do we lead organizations? How do we determine the short-term, long-term strategies? How do we implement these strategies? And fortunately, today we have Professor David Waldman, a top leader in this area, to guide us through this discussion. And we have a great moderator, Karen, to facilitate this discussion. So towards the end, they will talk to each other and answer some questions from the audience. So I hope we can all learn from this, and we will do our part of innovate and create growth and lead organizations to make global impact. So the last piece is I have a challenge and open invitation to all of you, because most of you are our alums. I have an old friend, old for various reasons. I've known him for 25 years, and he's turning 94 right now. So he was the co-chair of the Business Roundtable in the United States. He was the CEO of Monsanto for years. So he has 3 words to describe a life. Learn, that's the first one. Earn, that's the second one. The third one is return. You return to your family, you return to your community. As distinguished alumni, I know you all have great experiences, you have leadership, you have networks. So I pledge, I ask you to return to this community with your time. For example, you can come back to give a talk. You can be a case judge. You can host our students either on site in your company or talk with our company in Gaia. And we're looking for mentors, not only for the youngsters, I call them youngsters because they are 18 or 20 years old, but also for young alums when they graduate at age 22, 24. They also need mentors, right? The NBS Global Leaders Program, we need mentors. And each year we turn out 1,100 undergraduate students. We want you to help them, to train them, to provide opportunities, perhaps for internships, and sometimes for jobs, or to guide them how to navigate the early part of their career. So I have this plea for your help, and I really hope that you can return to the community. At the same time, if you have any suggestions, what NBS can do further to help you to develop, to learn, please let us know. Thank you in advance. I hope you enjoy today's learning experience. And without further ado, Professor David Waldman, the podium is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I cannot tell you how happy I am to be here in such a beautiful hotel. This place is just absolutely gorgeous. And by the way, this is my second time in Singapore. My first time was visiting another university that will remain unnamed. Right, Dean? Unnamed. But I'm very happy to be hosted by NTU this morning. Now, this talk is all about contradictions and living with contradictions and not being too upset about contradictions. I think in many ways it's a natural human reaction to not like contradictions, to not like what I'm going to be calling paradoxes, to be uncomfortable with paradoxes. My hope is after today, if you are a little bit uncomfortable with paradoxes, you'll be less uncomfortable, okay? Now, speaking of a paradox or a contradiction, I want to start off with a question to you. I am from the state of Arizona in the United States. How many of us have been to Arizona? A few people. Now, think about Singapore for a moment, and then think about that. That's generally what I see when I look out my back door in my home. It's a little bit different landscape. It isn't that the beauty of our planet, the contradictions that we have, the comparisons that we can make. Makes life kind of fun in a way, right? To have these different sorts of geographical settings. Okay, so with all of that in mind, here's the agenda for my talk this morning. And by the way, I'm not going to be that long. We're going to get into a nice discussion in just a little while. It's basically fivefold. First thing is, I'm going to take this out of the realm of leadership and management just for a moment. Just for a moment. We'll get into leadership in just a moment, and just talk about the kinds of contradictions that we as people face in our personal and professional lives. I'm going to give you a few examples of that. Now, then I'm going to talk about the leadership role in general and how dealing with paradoxes fits into that leadership role. Okay, so kind of gradually narrowing it down to paradoxes in leadership, which is the third point. The nature of leadership paradoxes and alternative approaches to deal with leadership paradox, what I'm calling leadership paradoxes. Oh, one other thing as we go along. If you want, you can take pictures and all of that, but also if you want, you can just send me an email note and I'll send you my slides. That'll make it a lot easier. All right. And reasons, I'm going to give you some reasons why I think that a paradoxical leadership approach to paradoxes is the best way to go. But also kind of a caveat about why sometimes we may choose to actually avoid this approach that I'm going to be recommending. And then finally, this is what I hope for, a lively Q&A. There's our lively Q&A, okay? People raising their hands, and because I would like to learn from you folks, because I think I can learn just as much, if not more, from you folks than you can from me. Okay, I'm going to put you to work right from the start. I'd like you to look at this little survey. Hopefully you can see it from the back. And complete it, score it, and just put it aside for a few moments. So let's just take a moment or two, please. This is, I want you to answer each one of these questions on a 1 to 5 scale. Add up your score. If you notice, it's 9 questions on a 1 to 5 scale, so your score can range anywhere from, by the way, this is not a research project, folks. Okay? I have not gone through a IRB process or anything to make sure. This is just for you so that we can talk about this. We're going to get back to this a little bit later. I'm not going to tell you what it's about right now, but we'll get back to it. So your score can range, after you add it up, anywhere from 9 to 45, right? Easy math. So after you add up your score, divide it by 5. Or excuse me, it's not 5, 9. Divide it by 9. So the bottom line is that the final score will be somewhere between 1 and 5. I'll give you a moment to do this. After all, I am a professor. You didn't think you were going to get away from not doing any work today. I mean, just like the old days, right? One other thing about this, as you answer them, answer truthfully. Not the way that you'd like to see yourself, but rather the way that you think you really are. Be truthful. By the way, after you do the math, if you come up with a score that's close to 1, we're going to have to do some work, some individualized work with you, I think, afterwards. How we doing? We almost there? Just about there? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to come back to this in just a little while. Now, let's just think about contradictions in real life, in our personal lives. There was a guy named Kirk Douglas. I don't know if you've ever heard of Kirk Douglas. You may have heard, he was an actor in the 1950s and 1960s who had a famous son. Well, actually, Kirk Douglas was famous too, but he had a famous son called Michael Douglas. And there they are together. I'm sure you remember Michael Douglas in some movies. And this is a quote from Kirk Douglas. He said, "My kids never had the advantage that I had because I was born poor." You know, right on the surface, when you look at that, you would say, well, why is that an advantage, being born poor? But you can probably get a feeling for, what he was trying to get at, right? The reason, the undertone of the statement was, because I was born poor, I had to work for what I got. I appreciated what I got more than my kids could ever appreciate or empathize with. That's basically what he was saying, right? This is one of my heroes, Michael Jordan. Maybe you've seen this quote before. "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the winning shot and I missed. In other words, I failed over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." Think about that one for a moment. It's a contradiction, isn't it? But if you think about it, it makes sense. I'm going to come back to this particular quote during our discussion and get some more ideas from you about why that really is true, what he's saying. Okay, here's a question for you. This is getting more into the organizational or business world. Is there a contradiction or incompatibility between being an accomplished research scientist versus an accomplished entrepreneur? Some people would say, yeah, there is a contradiction there. In other words, you see the picture there, can we put this together, the light bulb going off and the money signs and all of that? And by the way, you see a website. One of the things that I'm always guilty of when I make these kinds of talks is what I call shameless self-promotion. Or maybe not so shameless. This is a center that I'm co-director of at Arizona State University that deals with technology transfer, and we try to answer, for example, through our research, questions like this. So basically, the idea is, can we go from, here's a picture of research scientists to, this is what tech transfer is all about, technology transfer, to a marketable product, like a therapeutic, a drug. And can we bring those two together? Can the people on the left actually be the people who are in on, making the actual drug, or do they just stay in their labs and that's the way it goes? Well, I want to show you one more picture. Anybody know who this guy is? This gentleman? Anybody? No? Let me give you a hint. He's an MIT scientist, very famous MIT scientist, bioscientist, who is also the founder and former CEO of some little company called Moderna. How many of us have heard of Moderna? Yeah, we've heard of Moderna. Okay. His name is Robert Longer. Now, Robert Longer is sort of the consummate person in terms of saying yes to this above question. Robert Longer is a very accomplished scientist in his own right from MIT. He has, I was just looking it up recently, roughly about 450,000 citations. Now, this is one of the key metrics that we use in academia to judge how good a scientist is, how prolific we are. Are other people citing our work is the bottom line. That's what citations are all about. He has about 450,000 cites, which puts him on the very tail end of the positive tail end. I like to think of myself as at least somewhat accomplished. I have about 45,000 sites, so about 1/10 of Robert Longer. It's still pretty good. I mean, it's nothing too shabby, but you know, thank you, Dean. But you know, Longer is incredible. He's also a billionaire, by the way. He didn't get it from his salary at MIT, trust me. And he didn't get it from grants from NSF or NIH, National Institutes of Health in the United States. He got it as a businessman. So he is the consummate answer yes to this question, even though on the surface it would seem like there's a contradiction there in terms of these career paths, right? For a lot of people at least. Okay, so let's put this in the realm of leadership now. More shameless self-promotion. This is my book that I wrote with a guy named Charles O'Reilly at Stanford University on leadership for organizations. It's essentially a textbook, pretty much. But instead of being one of those textbooks that's about this thick, it's more like about that thick as a textbook, which means, this is my hope anyway, that the students might actually read it. At least I hope. Okay, so one of the things that I do in this book is say that, you know, and this is what I tell my students in class, like it or not, everything that we teach you in our courses, and I bet you can testify to this, it's a sad little truth, a little hidden secret, you're going to forget in 10 years. Pretty much everything. But what we hope sticks with you is a certain way of thinking about problems, like critical thinking skills. And what I tell my students about the class that I teach is that I hope that there's at least 7 things that you will remember after you have forgotten everything else in this course. So, principle number 1, realize that effective leadership, it's a function of the leader, followers, and context. It's very hard to say that there is one approach to leadership, period, in all contexts for all followers. Now, with that said, principle number 2, though, is a sort of a generic principle. Lead by example. By the way, you may be wondering, where does paradoxes come in here? I'm getting to that. We're getting to that. So lead by example. Don't expect people to do things that you're not willing to do. If you're asking people, for example, to work long hours, to engage in change, whatever, make sure that you're a role model of what you expect people to do. Seems pretty simple. Now here's one that always stumps me about why this is so hard to identify with. Leading by walking around, like what I'm doing now, but literally leading by walking around, being among the people that you're trying to inspire and lead, rather than just staying in your ivory tower office or among your top management team. You know who was famous for this? A guy named Sam Walton. You know who Sam Walton was? Yeah, Walmart, right. The guy who started Walmart. He was very famous for getting in his pickup truck, you know, Arkansas in the United States, he was out in the country, and going around to Walmarts. Now, why was he doing that? Was he doing it to check up on people? Make sure they're working hard? No, it was to try to understand what their issues were, what their problems were, and how he could help them as their leader. That's leading by, well, not walking around. In his case, it was driving his pickup around, but you get the point. Okay, provide recognition to others. I remember a quote from a woman named Mary Kay Ash, who started Mary Kay Cosmetics in the United States, now deceased. And she said it's like everybody that she tries to lead has an invisible sign around their neck that if you could see it, it would say, please give me praise, please give me recognition, please confirm that I'm doing a good job. And yet, so often, they don't get that recognition. They don't get that praise. Okay, so this is the 4th principle. 5th one, practice be here now. Another term for this is mindfulness. You know, these days, of course, we have all kinds of distractions like these little devices, right? And when somebody is communicating to you and you're the leader and they have an issue on their mind, they have a problem, be it personal or business related, they want your attention. You want your leader's attention, right? If you come to him or her with an issue. That's the whole idea of be here now, or mindfulness. Take actions, make decisions, and build. Not necessarily buildings, but you know what I'm saying, projects or new things, new products, whatever. I heard a quote from a CEO once that really stuck with me. It said that an effective CEO is somebody who can make 3 very difficult decisions in a given day. Have 2 of them go south, go bad, in other words, or at least start to go bad, and then go home and sleep like a baby. And then the next day, they start all over again. It's the CEOs that cannot have those decisions, because all decisions, not all decisions, but a lot of decisions you're going to have a hard time implementing, or that it may not be the best decision, and you have to be able to live with it as a leader and not stress you out too much. Okay, that brings us to think and act paradoxically. That's the 7th principle in the book, and these are not necessarily in this order, but for today's purpose, this is the order I'm presenting them in. Okay, I'm a professor. I've got to give you at least one definition. So right? So here's my one definition today. I hope. Paradox. So let's dissect this definition, and because it's important that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. I think some people have different impressions of what a paradox is. It's 2 seemingly contradictory phenomena. I like to call them 2 poles of a continuum. 2 seemingly contradictory phenomena that on the surface seem very irreconcilable. There's no way you can put them together. At least it seems that way on the surface. But nevertheless, those 2 things are actually interdependent. If you dig down a little bit, they're interdependent for the purpose of achieving effectiveness as a leader, which is all of our goals, right? Achieving effectiveness. And thus need to be reconciled simultaneously and continuously over time. That's how I'm defining a paradox. Now, here are some examples of some key paradoxes that challenge leaders. I'm going to put them in 3 different categories. One is supervisory actions. This one's a classic one. We're going to deal a little bit with this one this morning. It symbolizes everything there is to symbolize about the definition that I just gave you, right? Gaining control by giving up control. Seems nutty, right? When you look at it, say, well, what is that? How does that work exactly? How do I gain control by giving up control? That's a true paradox. On the surface, seems irreconcilable, but it's these 2 notions here of gaining control versus giving up control are actually interdependent. If the ultimate, over time, that's the key term here, over time, if the goal is to be effective. And we'll be talking about, well, how exactly do you do that? That's part of our discussion a little bit later on. It's my favorite one among all of these paradoxes. Personality, not just our actions, but our personality. Now here's a controversial one. Combining a strong sense of self, even to the point of a degree of narcissism. That's a term that sometimes takes people aback a little bit. Combined with humility. So again, on the surface, people would scratch their head and say, well, wait a minute. I'm either going to be narcissistic as a person, or I'm going to have an awful lot of humility, but ne'er the 2 shall come together, right? At least on the surface, it would seem that way. Well, I'll get back to this one also in just a moment, a few ideas. And then we can talk about strategies. We're all strategic leaders here, so let's talk a little bit about strategies. Maintaining continuity in the short term while simultaneously taking steps to deal with change for the long term. You have to be able to do both continuously over time to be a good leader, especially these days. Maybe in the old days you could pick one or the other, like just short term, dealing in a firefighting mode all the time. But really not anymore. You have to be able to deal with this paradox. Stressing diversity while simultaneously achieving unity. Now those are 2 kind of opposite things if you think about it. Diversity stresses differences. Unity stresses sameness in terms of such things as the same sense of purpose, similar values, So this can be a paradox as well. Now here's a controversial one, combining nationalism and globalism. Not that long ago, the term nationalism, especially when it came to business, was kind of a bad word in many people's minds. That seems to be going out the door more and more. And I've always kind of scratched my head about this one because, you know, if you ever observe something like the World Cup, there's nationalism all over the place, right? People celebrating their countries and rooting, and they have flags, and everybody thinks it's just perfectly normal. But then somehow in the business community, there seemed to be a feeling that grew, I don't know, not that long ago, that nationalism is not a good thing. We should all be global managers without any sense of nationalism whatsoever. But this is also a paradox that needs to be dealt with. I think there was an article that hopefully was shared with you that I wrote in Harvard Business Review several years ago on this very topic with my colleague Mansur Javedan from Thunderbird School of Global Management. Okay, so let's just pick on this one for a moment and talk about non-paradoxical versus paradoxical leadership. What's the difference? And there are differences about how we might deal with these paradoxes. So, here's some alternatives for leaders when dealing with paradoxes, again using this control paradox as an example. Here's a non-paradoxical approach to this paradox. You stress one pole of the paradox but not the other. So you say to yourself or to others, I will emphasize my role as a leader to direct and control followers and the organization regardless of the situation, regardless of the point of time. That's my job, is to be a controller, essentially, for the most part. That's a one best way approach, to the paradox, emphasizing only one pole of the paradox, not both. Now here's another thing, which maybe you remember from your organizational behavior classes, if you took that a while back. You could apply a situational or contingency approach. So you would say to yourself this, depending on the situation, I will maintain strict control in certain situations. But in other situations, at other times, I will relinquish control. So for example, Damien, you don't mind if I pick on you for a second. Okay, so I know that Damien here, I can trust to give up control to. I've seen him perform well in the past, accept responsibility, and so I'm going to relinquish some control, give him some autonomy. You're welcome. Now, on the other hand, Eric, I've dealt with Eric in the past, and I've tried to, develop him and everything, and what I have found is I got to kind of watch Eric like a hawk. I'm just kidding, right? Because I don't even know. Oh, it's true, though. Okay, it's true. All right, well, I doubt it, but anyway. So you see what I'm saying? So it's a situational approach to whether or not I'm giving up control or taking it in, usurping my control. Okay, so what's the bottom line then? Bottom line is the paradoxical leadership approach, which I think is the best way overall to deal with these paradoxes, is to integrate the two poles over time, fully embracing the paradox. It's what we call a both-and approach. So I realize that the best way to gain control as a leader over time is to continuously find ways to give up my personal control over time. And if I do that, I will be an effective leader. And there are people some famous people who I think have practiced this principle without coming right out and saying it. One of my favorite ones was the founder of Southwest Airlines in the United States, who is now deceased, Herb Kelleher. I really believe that, that he practices. I remember a quote hearing him say once, "Never had control, never wanted it." I've never believed that totally. I think what he was saying was he built an organization where he did not have to continuously take control of things. And that's how he maintained control. Think about that for a moment. A culture and an organization. Oh, actually, I'm going to go backwards here. Okay, I just want to go over a few examples of how this would work in reality, right? Aside from the control paradox. So I want to pick on just a few more of these paradoxes, like this personality paradox. How can I blend these two things together? One thing to think about in terms of this integration of these things is that each one of those poles, narcissism versus humility, has its strengths, but it also has its weaknesses. Both of them. You may be wondering, what is the strength of narcissism again? And some of you may be wondering that. Well, this is one thing that we know about narcissistic leaders. They want to lead. They want to make decisions. They want to build. They think they are natural-born leaders. That's a positive thing. Remember with some of the principles that I mentioned earlier? That's a positive thing. But there's obviously a downside to narcissism. The downside is that they oftentimes think the world is just about them, accomplishments are just about them, everything's about them, right? They have a hard time accepting feedback. On the other hand, leaders who are very humble, well, that can be a very good thing. A lot of people like humility in their leaders, but on the other hand, humility can be taken to the extent that you're too humble. You're not willing to make decisions. You're too involving of people, and sometimes decisions need to be made quickly in a strong sort of way. So what can happen is if you combine these things, you can kind of get the best of both worlds. And another question you may be asking is that even possible? Well, it is, and our research has shown that it is possible to combine narcissism and humility in leaders. Believe it or not, we can talk a little bit more about that later, but another example here, stressing diversity while simultaneously achieving unity. How many of us in here have heard of the principle? I don't know if this is more of a US thing or international now, but of DEI. DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the key term here is diversity. Well, one of the things that, DEI, the way I look at it now, if you look at stories in the business world, in the government, and so forth, it's like DEI in the year 2025 is on life support, basically. It's just the way it is. Companies are throwing out their DEI, they're called chief diversity officers. I've actually done a study interviewing a bunch of chief diversity officers, and putting real restrictions on their quote-unquote DEI programs or their DEI initiatives. And I really believe that it comes back to this paradox notion and how the paradox has not been managed right. So in other words, the way that DEI has largely been implemented is in such a way that hurts unity. It's divisive, the way it's been implemented. So the full paradox was not being taken into account. Without going into too much detail, I think that DEI could be rebranded in a way that does encourage unity, but it has not been, is the bottom line. That's another topic, but that we can talk about later, perhaps. But it's the same thing with unity on the other side of the coin. If you have unity without diversity, there's a problem that can develop. You know what that problem is? I'll give you a hint. It's a word that starts with G, the letter G. Groupthink. One thing we know for sure is that if you have too much unity without any diversity of thought, not necessarily saying diversity in terms of ethnicity or gender, it tends to go along with diversity of thought, but the key thing is diversity of thought, your heads, you're going to have a problem with groupthink. There's a good chance of it because you're not taking into account the full paradox. Now, this is key reason, just to kind of summarize quickly, why this harmonious integration is the most effective way of dealing with paradoxes. There's the realization that although these things are contradictory, these two poles of the paradox, they're interdependent. That's what I tried to point out by my examples. Sustained effectiveness cannot be achieved without this integration of the two poles. And I'm sure you've seen this symbol before. The yin and the yang is kind of at the heart of what this whole philosophy is all about, as applied to leadership. Now, I'm almost at the end here, then we can get into our discussion. But you may be wondering, scratch your head, well, what are some of the reasons why people either avoid or engage in what I'm calling this paradoxical leadership? And I think a lot of it comes down to the head and how we process information, how we think about things. And in this picture, what I'm showing are two different ways of thinking about problems, thinking about issues. One way is what I call linear thinking. It's a little bit hard to see, but what that says is, if I'm thinking in a linear way about a leadership problem, I'm saying to myself, for a leadership problem, I should apply solution A in order to get to outcome B. So if I want effectiveness in my organization, I need to maintain control, period. See, solution A, solution A leads to outcome Y. Why do people think that way? And by the way, I'm not necessarily being critical of linear thinking. I think it tends to go along with analytical thinking. It provides clarity. It's a kind of a safe approach to short-term problem solving. It avoids solutions that might cause some discomfort, let's say, psychological discomfort. It tends to be associated with a pretty narrow view of what is right versus what is wrong, versus lateral or holistic thinking. So the opposite here is that for a leadership problem, I should apply both solutions A and B relatively simultaneously to get at outcome Y. So it views a problem from multiple angles, multiple perspectives, and says each of these have value. Tends to be associated with things like creativity and innovation. Now, I have a quote from the famous old guy, Albert Einstein. He said, logic will get you from A to Y. In other words, linear thinking. Imagination will take you anywhere. Imagination will take you anywhere. So basically what he was saying, and he was, I think, very good at this, is that linear thinking is fine, but we have to be able to combine that at times with more holistic thinking. And he was very good at that. I watched a movie on the way over here, on the airplane, Oppenheimer. And I think he was pretty good at this, combining these two forms of thinking as well. Matter of fact, in the movie, I can't remember exactly what the paradox was. It was some physics paradox that he started off with. Remember that in the movie, if you saw it in a lecture to his students? He mentioned a paradox. I can't remember what it was, but anyway. Okay, back to this. This is a key part of paradoxical thinking, paradoxical mindset, which then leads into paradoxical leadership. And what I would say is that if you score somewhere between 4 and 5, you're well on your way to being a good paradoxical leader, if that truly is accurate for you. Because a big part of the problem is, how do you embrace the paradox? Do you fight it off? Does it make you feel extremely uncomfortable? Or are you willing to embrace it and work with it and try to find a paradoxical solution? So here are my conclusions. Leaders face an array of paradoxes. That's what I pointed out before, pertaining to their actions as a leader, their personality, and their strategies. By the way, I've only mentioned some. There are more. Perhaps you can tell me some more later in a few moments. Leaders should attempt to address paradoxes using this, what I'm calling harmonious integration, essentially paradoxical leadership, more lateral, holistic thinking, and certainly the development of a paradox mindset. Enough. Don't want to give you power. I don't know if you've ever been to a presentation, you saw 200 slides. I don't have 200 slides. This is basically all I have, and so thanks for listening, and now it's your turn. Or I guess in a moment it will be.
Thank you, Professor David, for that wonderful presentation. The insights you shared today will undoubtedly spark some thoughtful discussion. We now move into the Q&A portion of our event. I'd like to invite Professor David to take a seat on stage, and to lead this discussion, I'd like to invite Karen Leong, our moderator, to join Professor David on stage. Karen, Professor, over to you.
Right, Professor David. No, I mean, you asked me to call you David. You prefer that, so we're gonna do that.
Very informal in the United States,
Yeah,
culture.
this is an inner circle conversation. Now, I have to say that this was a fascinating take on paradoxical thinking, and I want to say something because all of us are already dealing with paradoxes all our lives. In fact, whether as individual contributors or leaders, we're balancing, say, three main paradoxes. The balance between work and life, the balance between our jobs, our career, and the balance between our own aspirations and organizational KPIs. Mm-hmm. So this is a reality. But I think what you have done is to shift and expand our perspectives. But I do have two major complaints, David. I mean, the first complaint is that you've packed so much into such a short amount of time that it's going to take us hours to unpack and even longer to put into action. And the second thing I have to complain is that you have actually forced me to confront my biases, my inherent biases at paradoxes. And I have so many burning questions right now to ask you.
Okay.
And I'm sure just looking at the faces here, the audience here also has a lot to ask. So we're going to jump straight into this with the very first question, because I am curious, as a leadership scholar and as a consultant, if you look back into your journey, what really inspired you to look at paradoxical thinking? I mean, from your experiences or from your observations?
Well, I started doing research, I hate to admit this, in the area of leadership and transformational leadership back in the 1980s. And I was always taught through our scholarship that we should be looking for one best way approaches to leadership. Or maybe, situational leadership came into the picture. But I took a trip to Beijing in 2010, visited Beijing University, and started talking to some scholars there who kind of opened my eyes up to this notion of paradoxical leadership, which was also starting to gain some traction in our literature, very early stages. And I got very interested in the concept and how it would fit in with, just the other aspects of leadership that I was interested in.
And paradoxical thinking is obviously important. And so what do you see in the shifting business landscape that makes paradoxical thinking a non-negotiable today?
My perception is that the business world, the organizational world is becoming incredibly complex. You can't take an either-or approach to things as much as perhaps we could in the past. And that's why, there are contradictions that are out there that we have to face, that we have to simultaneously deal with. Basically.
And so knowing that is important, and I think, especially here in Singapore, in Asia, we are all used to the benefits of situational leadership. And I think many people, they link situational leadership and paradoxical leadership maybe along the same line, the same plane. But you have highlighted that there are differences. Yeah. And I'd love to hear more of your stories,
okay.
About what makes it different and how can we navigate both effectively?
Well, that's a good question. By the way, I'm not saying, and again, it's not an either-or kind of thing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be good situational leaders, at a given point in time. That's the key thing, a given point in time. The difference, though, is that paradoxical leadership is really more of a long-term sort of strategy as a leader. Yes, we have to deal with situations as they're given to us, but dealing with these paradoxes, they tend to be persistent over time. So I think that's the key difference, is the time factor.
I have a sense, this Q&A is not just going to be between myself and David. I do want to take a little bit of a pause just to throw the opportunity to anybody who wants to jump in with any burning questions, and then we can then return to the dialogue. So I'm just curious, we're going to set a bit of time for anyone to ask questions. And I know we have a roving mic here, I think, is it John? Yes.
Hello, David. Thank you for this very insightful presentation. I'm Catherine Wu from NTU. I have a question. I like to know, all of this is, paradox exists all around us. And naturally, what you're saying, we are tempted to see things as either or. My question is, as a leader, dealing with all kinds of things in the daily life, how do you recognize that you are facing a paradox? And you need to start thinking of it. You need to into this both and mode of thinking instead of the
right.
either or that we are naturally inclined to.
I think what you're asking is how do we deal with this in reality, or how do we put these two things together? Because a lot of these paradoxes, the different poles, you can't show them at exactly the same moment in time, right? But maybe one way of thinking about it is that we all face leadership problems or episodes that may last for a day, a week, longer than that. So you can ask yourself the question as you go through these episodes, for example, something that might be dealing with change in your organization. At the same time, you could ask yourself, during this episode, during this period of time, am I taking time to not only deal with the change for the long term, but also holding on to certain aspects of continuity for the short term? How am I blending these two things together during this leadership episode? Not at the same moment in time, but you know what I'm saying, during this episode.
Hi, David. It's Joanne. I'm an NBS alumni. Just listening to you, and I was just wondering, would paradoxical leadership be distilled down to something like conflict management and reconciliation? Or is it broader than that?
I think it relates to conflict management, but the conflict might be more in your head. That's why I got to this cognition, between these two notions. I'll go back to narcissism and humility. That may form a real conflict in your head, especially if you have your value system would suggest that one pole of the paradox is just not good. See what I'm saying? That's where I think conflict can come really into play. It's like an intra-individual conflict in a way.
So it really points to that internal bias that we may have towards just preferring one pole versus another pole. So I'm just curious, do you have a practical tip for us to recognize our bias and overcome it?
I always tell people, just be more open-minded. Recognize your biases and question them a little bit. Where did I get that bias from? I really believe, and this goes back to Albert Einstein's quote, you really have to be open-minded about both poles of the paradox.
Professor, I'm Chow Kiet. I have a question on whether actually above paradoxical leadership, we can think about it as a system thinking. That's one plane higher. That you're not just dealing with...
Good question. These are all great questions, by the way. I'm not sure it's one plane. I think it's just part of systems thinking, in a way. It's an aspect of it. I think that when you're only remember what I told you, the cognition before about A leads to Y as opposed to A and B? People who are more systems thinkers take into account more variables and how they interrelate to each other, to the outcome, all of that. And I think paradoxical thinking is along those lines.
Hi, David. I'm Marcus.
Oh.
Hi. Thanks for sharing about paradoxical leadership. So my question actually is to center in your experience about doing research. Maybe you can name one leader, either business or political leader from the West, that exhibit some of their traits and a leader from the East that exhibits some of the traits, and why do you pick them?
Okay, and I hinted at this person before, but I'll say a little bit more about him. Herb Kelleher, who's now deceased as of several years ago. He's the founder of Southwest Airlines and was CEO for a number of years, or chairman of the board. He was, definitely a systems level thinker, a holistic kind of thinker, and he had some famous quotes, including the one that I used before. He said, I'll never forget this, it's like this: never had control, never wanted it. I'll never forget that quote. I saw him in a video. And because I think he was asked by a financial analyst about, well, how can you give up so much control to your subordinates, to your people? And that was his response, right? But I really think that he embodied that paradox of taking control by giving up control. So gradually over time, this again, over time, he built a culture where he could feel comfortable, more or less, giving up control, but at the same time, he really had control, right? But the way he did it was not through rules, bureaucracy, and all that. It was through the culture that he built. So that's an example, at least one.
Actually, it brings to mind another example from Asia. Pretty much, in JAL Airlines, I think they were, decades ago, they were bleeding financially. And they had a Western CEO that focused on hiring and firing in order to make the airline profitable. And then what happened is that then they decided to call back their Hiriko Hichimatsu, which was your former CFO. And he had a very quiet confidence about him. He gained control by actually letting go control. What he did was he actually reduced his salary, which was quite unknown in Japan at the point of time, to less than that of a pilot's salary. Mm-hmm. And he became at one with the people who are in the front lines.
Well, there's another thing about Kelleher that I'll bring up, not just this gaining control, but by giving up control. He was also, some people talked about him as being somewhat narcissistic. But on the other hand, he also had a fair amount of humility. He was more than willing to try to learn and take in feedback. And he gave a lot of recognition to other people. The thing about Southwest, I heard an old saying that if you really want to, lose your trousers, so to speak, get into the airline business as a business. It's a tough business. Awful lot of bankruptcies and all that. Southwest never was in the red in its history. And you compare that to other American airlines, like American Airlines, United, Delta, they've all gone through Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And Southwest, even during, after 9/11. And they never got any money from the government after 9/11, unlike other airlines in the United States, interestingly enough.
Very nice example of balancing confidence with humility.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of interest in this room, I sense, about the East and the West approach to paradoxical thinking. And I'm curious because you've traveled, and worked with audiences across cultures. So do you see a difference in the different approaches, and how can each learn from one another?
My guess, that's a great question, Karen. My guess is in many ways, for most of the paradoxes that I gave you, that I'm preaching to the choir. You've heard that expression, right? Preaching to the choir. It's probably in some ways second nature to you. Now, if I was giving this talk and having this discussion with executives in the United States, it might be a little bit more of a mixed bag. Okay? Now, the only difference, getting back to you folks, that might be a little bit difficult for you to stomach, maybe, is the narcissism versus humility paradox. Wouldn't surprise me if that was a little bit tougher, because I think that this is my impression, in Eastern culture, humility is highly valued. Right? Maybe? Not so much in Western culture, just
Hi, David. This is Richie. I'm at NBS. When you were speaking, an idea came to mind from cross-cultural psychology called dialectical thinking. Back in the day, they used to think that people from a lot of Eastern cultures are better able to hold contradictions for longer, and they have the cognitive complexity to process it. And I think the bit that the question is going to come, I promise. The bit that I'm interested in is, it's not about resolving contradictions. It's not about not having contradictions, it's just not resolving them prematurely. Because eventually to take action, you will have to make a call one way or the other in any given moment. So given that background, what do you think leaders have to do in the moment to withhold early resolution?
Well, in the moment, again, in the moment, they'll probably have to be stressing one pole of the paradox. But again, I want to stress this two things. One, it's an ongoing long-term process, and it's not a matter of coming to a resolution. It's a journey in many ways, dealing with the paradox. It never totally gets resolved, but it's a strategy of leading, essentially.
It also reminds me a story of one of my coaches. As a new leader, she was very decisive. So that was her bias. And it got her great results. The team loved it because there was immense traction. But when she started to move up to upper management, it kind of backfired because she was so decisive that she was the one making the decisions all the time. And so I remember asking her one time, what's the opposite of decisive? And she says, indecisive. And most of us would think that way. But that's when I asked her, what if you saw the opposite of decisive as innovation? What would that change for you? And then she started thinking that, actually, if I saw the opposite as innovation, and she added inclusion, then I would be giving the space to people to make decisions, and there will be more ideas, more sharing, and that is great. And so I think, it's really about giving that space and realizing that with that mindset shift, we will be able to act accordingly naturally. And
that makes sense.
I am just really curious at this point because, on a personal level, you will have faced some paradoxes in your own life journey.
Plenty.
So would you be able to share an example, and how do you reconcile that?
I don't know how much you folks know about how we as professors at a top school like NTU tend to be evaluated in order to maintain our reputation as top schools. We have to publish in a certain relatively small set of journals in our fields, right? And I was told very early on by some of my peers, colleagues, that an interest that I had that I wanted to pursue would not be publishable. There's a contradiction there. And that interest was to be interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary in my thinking, to work with people, God forbid, even people in finance or something. I don't know. I had to say that. I'm sorry, Dean. From finance, I've worked with people from finance, from operations management, from marketing, and even people outside of the business school, for example, neuroscience. And I always wanted to do it, but I was told by my peers, you better not. You'll never make tenure, you'll never make full professor, you'll never get those articles. And so there was a contradiction there, but I said to myself, I don't believe it. I'm not buying it. And I think there's a way to be more interdisciplinary in what I'm doing and still get published in those journals that they're talking about. It's not that I don't do the more traditional research I do, but I always had that interdisciplinary sort of interest, and so that was a conflict for me that I had to deal with. But I'm happy I went because I really believe that, look, you folks, my guess is when you're solving your problems that you all face, you don't say, well, this is just purely a leadership problem, or this is purely a marketing problem, or this is purely a finance problem, or whatever. These things come together, these disciplines. And we need to solve bigger problems, we need to think in interdisciplinary kinds of ways. And I'm sure you folks do that on a daily basis. I sometimes wish we did a little bit more in business schools.
It's a great story. And yes.
So great story. I love your stories, by the way. So if you can pepper them more in, that'll be great. What I really want to know in your last story is how did you ensure that you were actually then published in these journals? Right? What did you do to ensure that? That's the first question. The second question, and that goes a little bit more general to the topic at hand today, can you share some real case studies of people who tried to apply paradoxical leadership but failed? And why, right? Like, I'm asking for pitfalls because it's the overtime pieces. You drop tons of hints in there. Do it over time. Do it by building culture. But I think, for first-time leaders trying to put this in place, it would be great to hear some of these other stories of failure. Thank you.
That's a good question. I gave you the one of Kelleher. I can't think of any that I know of who failed with this approach. I don't know. I'd be willing to bet that if I really, I can give you a story of a chief diversity officer who I interviewed, who, actually I'm going to give you one of both failure, for that diversity and unity paradox. I'm going to give you an example of one who really seemed to be winning or doing a good job with it by paying attention to both poles, and one that did not. And I'm just wondering, I don't think I should name the companies. The one that did not, oh boy, should I say this? It's a big company in the United States. And I interviewed a CDO who actually ended up being fired a couple or 3 months after the interview. This was about a year ago. In the retail industry, I'll say that. And this person, I could tell in the interview, the way that she was trying to implement DEI in her organization was very divisive. A lot of training that involved trying to shame people, like white males, as a way of trying to make them come around to a certain way of thinking. Quota-based hiring, which is another reason why DEI has gotten kind of a black eye. And basically what she was doing was implementing diversity, or DEI, in a way that did not take into account the unity aspect, the other side of the paradox. In other words, it was divisive. It was destroying unity. Now, on the other hand, I talked to another person in the construction industry. They build cranes and big cranes and stuff like that, that totally understood this paradox. And a very delightful person. And my guess is, even if DEI somehow fades in the woodwork, she's not going to fade into the woodwork. She'll come out doing just fine in some kind of HR position or whatever. And she totally recognized that you can celebrate and stress diversity and do things to encourage people to recognize the value of diversity at the same time that you're building unity. And I'll give you an example of that. She said that as part of their diversity training in her organization, there's no such thing as just saying that white males have unconscious biases and they need to be aware of it. Instead, they stress that everybody has unconscious biases, and we all need to be aware of those biases against people who are different from us, or we might have those biases. So she was stressing diversity, right, but at the same time stressing unity in that kind of thinking. Pardon me?
How did you get published?
What was say it again, that part of the question?
So you said that you were told that you would not get published if you went into this business, right?
Right.
But you got published anyway.
Oh, this brings me back to Michael Jordan. Remember that quote I gave you? There's a shorter version of that quote that a lot of people like to use. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Think about that. You miss 100% of the shots, like in basketball, that you don't take. I took shots. And I kept taking those shots, basically. Even though people told me, don't waste your time, don't take that shot, take this other shot.
Very thought-provoking. And I'm just curious if you have one or two questions that you would want the audience to reflect on so that, we could actually go deeper.
Okay. Maybe one question that I would have for people, I mentioned some key paradoxes here. And like I told you before, that managers or leaders face. It's not the whole kit and caboodle. It's not all of them. I'm wondering if you think of some paradox that you face that I have not mentioned that you find to be especially intriguing or challenging. There's a lot of these paradoxes around, a lot more than what. Let me give you one more example of a paradox that I didn't even mention. The idea of building up a kind of a group cohesion, a group effort, a team effort, at the same time that you're rewarding star performers. Most athletic coaches have that challenge. But I think also in business and in organizations, we have that challenge. We want to encourage and reward our star performers, but yet at the same time, we want to develop a team effort. And that may seem kind of paradoxical. But anyway, that's my question. Can you think of any others that you face?
We're happy if anybody would like to share, to comment, feel free to grab the mic.
Yeah, thank you, David. I guess a very constant challenge that many business leaders will face is about being consistent, yet at the same time being flexible. Because you want to build consistent as a leader's brand. You want to be seen as being consistent in a certain way you make decisions, right? So if you embrace paradox, will it risk in the sense that you want to emphasize on control, yet at the same time you want to also talk about being decentralized or losing control? I guess maybe that's a paradox many leaders face.
Yeah, well, I guess, we tend to associate control with being centralized in decision making and giving up control with being decentralized, right? And so how do you...
Yeah, it's more about being a leader, you want to have a brand as a leader's brand, right? You want to be consistent. Right. You want to be consistent in the way you lead the organizations.
Right.
So I guess the question is, if you embrace a paradoxical leadership kind of a behavior, would it risk that reputation of being a consistent leader?
I don't know. That's a tough one. I'm not totally sure I understand the question. Can we be consistent and inconsistent?
So can I just check whether, like for example, in politics, political leaders who are consistent, the voters regard them, more highly because they feel that these people are driven by values. They're not the ones that keep, roving. Like for example, I think Jimmy Carter used to change his mind a lot, and it was given a negative.
Right.
Even though in the world of science, Einstein always says that, actually we do not knowing and being wrong is one of the great virtues of being a scientist.
Right.
So how do you reconcile with paradoxical thinking and having a perceived authentic brand?
Well, let me see if I can try to answer that. I think it's good for leaders to be consistent according to their basic vision, their basic values. Then sometimes their actions may seem inconsistent, right, with those things. Maybe the trick is just explaining why they're being inconsistent, understanding, the times when they are inconsistent with those basic values, that basic vision, and letting people know what their thinking is all about. Why, in this instance, am I being inconsistent or seeming that way?
It brings to mind a leader that has always been seen as a very dominant leader. And he kind of decided to embrace humility. So he actually opened the new year telling people that these are my strengths, but these are also my weaknesses. This was the first time he did it. And that actually increased people's respect for him because he says, I want to tap into all your strengths. So in a way, embracing his weaknesses and being vulnerable gave him more respect. So,
You know, when you're practicing paradoxical leadership, the way I've described it, I think people will tend to see you as less dogmatic about things, that you can see things from different angles. That's what I think good paradoxical thinking does for you in the eyes of other people.
you know, we've had a very stimulating conversation so far, and I know we have some time after this Q&A for more dialogue and more conversations, but I want to ask you, what is that one last thing that you want to leave us all with?
Be open-minded about the various poles of a paradox. When you encounter certain paradoxes or things that are like some of the ones that I've mentioned, there are some preconceived notions that we all have. We all have our biases. But I think the best paradoxical leaders are the ones that can remain open-minded about the various poles of paradoxes.
Thank you so much, David. And this has been such an engaging conversation. I know we wish we can continue. I have to say that I took away two big things. That, you know, when we are aware of our biases, be curious enough to explore other people's point of view.
Yes.
And the second thing is that when we think of just being more paradoxical and embracing it, our actions would naturally flow. So I want to thank you so much for this conversation today. And I myself look forward to applying these insights because that's the only thing that can change the game, and I'm sure all of you as well. But I also want to thank Nanyang Business School for setting up such a great event. And as an NBS alumni, I look forward to more such events in the future. Thank you so much, Professor David.
Right. If you have any further conversation, thank you. Just feel free to send me an email note if you want to continue conversation, or call me up on the phone or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you, David and Karen, for such an enlightening and dynamic discussion. And to our audience, thank you for the wonderful participation. We would now like to invite the Dean to the stage to present a token of appreciation to our moderator and speaker. Dean, please.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you, Dean, and to all of you, we wish you continued success on your leadership journey. Just before you leave, we would really appreciate if you're able to provide your feedback for today's event by scanning the QR code on the screen. We will also like to mention NTU's own fundraising challenge, NTU Best Foot Forward, where NBS staff and alumni raise funds for NBS's bursary. So feel free to sign up with our team via the QR code to raise funds for the NBS Bursary Fund. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.